Hi. So welcome to this, I guess, um, final unit or section of lecture series number 2, and we've actually done quite a lot. So we've looked at software process models, the different software process models, waterfall, traditional model, incremental development, and also is it integration and configuration. And then we had a lengthy discussion centered around process activities, where we looked at the core phases associated with these different process models. So irrespective of what sort of process models you end up using, there are certain core activities that transcend these different process models. And then finally, in the previous section or unit, we looked at how we go about coping with change. So in this final unit or section, we are going to focus more on process improvement, and we are also going to have a recap of lecture series number 2. Okay, so on with it. Let me just switch off my webcam. Distraction, right? Right. So the idea behind leveraging so-called process improvement is to ensure that you actually deliver quality software. You drastically reduce the amount of money that will be spent on the software development project, and more importantly, try as much as possible to reduce the overall development time. So the timeline associated with execution of the entire project. Right, so key things really that provide a motivation for a process improvement is important. And remember that all these different things you just mentioned, the three aspects you just mentioned, are important because software development companies, like any other for-profit companies, are in the business of making money. And so the ways in which you're able to make money as a software development company is to ensure that there's increased quality of the product that you produce, right? That way you're able to attract more people. You spend less time on the software itself, you can charge more money, and then also drastically reduce the amount of money, right? And there's different ways of reducing the cost associated with the project. A classic example, for instance, is ensuring that you have a lean team, a lean development team. So you ensure that you have least possible number of developers that are going to create or write the software program itself. And then drastically reduce the development time. So instead of shipping a piece of software in 1 year, can you figure out a way in which you can accelerate the process and instead ship it out in 6 months, for instance? And so really what we're referring to when making reference to process improvement is this idea of trying to better understand the existing software processes and ways in which we can change these processes in order to increase the software product quality, drastically reduce the development time, and more importantly, ways in which we can reduce the overall cost associated with the project. So there's essentially two main approaches associated with process improvement. There's the process maturity approach and the agile approach. I guess we should mention from the outset here that the focus in this course is largely going to be on the agile approach, just because it's one of the most widely used approaches. Typically, the maturity approach is reserved for relatively large organizations or large-scale software projects or mission-critical software projects, for instance. So with the process maturity approach, the focus is generally more on the process and project management activities, and to a certain extent, the introduction of good software engineering practices. And so the maturity or the process maturity level will typically reflect how good the technical and management practices are for that particular software development organization. The agile approach, on the other hand, tends to focus more on incremental development and more specifically ways in which you can reduce the overhead associated with the software development lifecycle, the software processes. And so really some key traits that we've already discussed in previous sections here is things like incremental delivery, for instance, of functionalities to the customer by way of responding to the changing or potentially changing customer requirements, needs. So, but irrespective of the approach that you take, you tend to go through a process improvement lifecycle that is composed of 3 key aspects, right? So you always tend to want to come up with metrics that you use to measure, to gauge the overall process improvement process that you've adopted. You typically need to analyze the different software processes associated with the project that you are undertaking. Not perhaps, but at some stage, maybe incorporate changes into this process improvement cycle that you're going through, and then you measure again. So you go through this loop, right? Just to underscore these 3 key aspects of the process improvement lifecycle here. So when it comes to process measurement, what you're doing really is identifying indicators or attributes associated with the software processes of the product, and you use those attributes to actually measure how well you are improving the overall software processes. You tend to want to make an assessment of potential weaknesses and challenges associated with the process, and so process analysis will typically involve identifying these weaknesses and bottlenecks, right? And then once you identify the weaknesses and bottlenecks and challenges, you go through a process change where you incorporate changes that will help address the weaknesses and bottlenecks identified. And then you loop again, right? So you go through this cycle. Typically, seeing as you are performing some sort of measurement, it's usually advisable that you collect empirical data, right? So these indicators that you'd have identified would need to be empirically measured. It's usually a lot easier when the process that you're going through is empirical in nature. So you tend to want to go through a quantitative process of measuring those indicators. Although, granted, there are certain instances where it might not necessarily be possible for you to quantitatively measure the indicators. And also, the process measurement should ideally be used to assess the overall process improvement, right? So you use these key indicators that you've identified to gauge how good the process improvement process is. So just some examples of things or indicators that you'd go about measuring, indicators or otherwise called metrics. The obvious ones would be time, right? And time can take different forms. So this could be the number of man hours that are dedicated to a particular process activity, or perhaps the effort required to complete a particular activity or process. Right? Another metrics that could be used here is the resources that are required to undertake a particular process or activity. And this could range from let's say the total number of individuals that would have to be co-opted to see to it that the project is successfully executed, right? Or perhaps the number of developers that you'd need for you to design and implement a piece of software, right? Also, another metric that you could look at when it comes to resource here is the effort with regards to the man hours, the effort that would be required for you to successfully execute a particular process or activity, right? And also, there are other unconventional metrics that you could use to measure the overall process improvement process. And so this could be the potential number of bugs identified in the piece of software that you're implementing, or the defects that would have been identified by the customers or would be end users of the piece of software that you're developing, right? So, but the list is endless here. Key thing here is that these are all indicators that can be empirically measured. So as earlier mentioned, even though the maturity approach is not really going to be our focus in this particular course, but it's worth mentioning that there are well-established maturity approaches that exist out there. And one popular maturity approach is the so-called Software Engineering Institute Capability Maturity Models, otherwise called the CMM. And so the goal really of the capability maturity model is twofold. It acts as a framework that tends to be used to evaluate and improve the overall development process, right? And the idea here really is to use this framework to create quality software that would allow you to measure results associated with the software development process, and more importantly, to be able to replicate the results, right? So the results the overall process would have to be repeatable to a certain extent. Well, it's not important really, so the ideally a total of 5 steps associated with this so-called CMM approach, which is a software the capability maturity model. And so you start off by the initial step where you tend to characterize the processes, or you define the processes associated with the project that you're implementing. Next step is repeatability, where the basic project management processes are established, and you want to do this so that you're able to easily track the cost associated with the project, the timelines associated with the various process activities, and the functionality associated with the software system that you'd be implementing. Then comes the defined step, where so both the project management and technical engineering activities are formally documented and standardized. And then you have the manage step, where specific measurables of the software processes and product quality are collected and analyzed, right? Remember, we mentioned that irrespective of the process improvement approach that you take, you tend to go through this cycle here. So what we're saying there is you're collecting the metrics that you'd have identified in order to measure the relative success of the process improvement process, right? So you collect the metrics, you analyze the metrics, and then incorporate potential changes that you'd need. And then finally, you want to go through a process of optimizing this end-to-end process, because you'd have incorporated changes, you measure, and so you optimize that entire process until you come up with a near perfect process improvement technique. All right, so this screenshot just essentially shows you really the link between the 5 levels here that we just looked at. And again, just to mention that our focus is not really going to be on this particular approach. We are more interested in the agile approach. So just to recap on process improvement, we looked at 2 main techniques, which is the agile technique and the maturity approach. We briefly glossed over the process improvement cycle, which involves measurement, analysis, and incorporation of change. And then we introduced this notion of the importance of empirically measuring this process improvement cycle. We also highlighted the fact that this process improvement cycle is typically quantitative in nature. And then for good measure, we looked at a classic example of a maturity approach, which is Software Engineering Institute Capability Maturity Model. Right? Okay, so we've actually wrapped up lecture series number 2, and just remind us on what we've looked at so far. We started off by looking at the various software process models. We looked at a total of 3: the so-called waterfall model, incremental development, which is a process that's iterative in nature, typically involves coming up with different versions or variations of the software with the goal of ensuring that you incorporate all potential customer requirements as quickly as possible. And then we also spent quite a bit of time looking at integration and configuration, which typically involves using already existing components that are generally available out there. And these components could take the form of software libraries, or in certain instances, web services that are accessible using so-called application programming interfaces. And then we went through, this lengthy chart of highlighting the key process activities associated with the software development lifecycle. So we explained what requirements engineering is all about, design and implementation, which are sometimes interleaved or sometimes looked at as being separate entities or activities, depending on what sort of software process model you adopt. We also looked at verification and validation, and highlighted the fact that one of the key things that's important to incorporate into verification and validation is system testing, to ensure that you confirm the system features and functionalities conform to the original customer requirements or needs. And then we explained how software tends to evolve as the user needs change with time, right? This is typically triggered by changing business needs, and to a certain extent maybe changes in hardware and software platforms that are associated with the software developed. And then we really spend time to look at the importance of coping with changing requirements. And we discussed 2 main approaches, which is prototyping and incremental delivery. And we really did explain in what instances you'd want to use prototyping and what instances you want to use incremental delivery, right? Specifically, you tend to use prototyping in order to verify that the requirements are comprehensive and complete, right? Different types of prototypes exist, even though we will have a lengthy chat on rapid application prototyping, but we made mention of pair prototypes and low fidelity prototypes. And then we finally, in the previous section, we went through the process of explaining why process improvement is important. We highlighted 2 key approaches associated with process improvement: the agile approach, which we said is going to be the key focus of this course, and of course the maturity approach, right? And we gave an example of the so-called Software Engineering Institute capability maturity model. All right, so that wraps up lecture series number 2. Just a quick note on how we're going to conduct the Q&A session. This is still work in progress, but based upon some of the things that have happened in the recent past, and specifically our online interaction recently, we think that for this to work, we are going to try out something new. So if you have specific questions associated with this lecture series, you have a couple of options, 2 options really. Either you write an email and send your question to the mailing list, the course mailing list, with as much detail as possible associated with your question, and then we shall respond to it. The other alternative is for you to use your smartphone or your computer or something to record your questions. So it used to be a combination of voice and I guess if you want, you can show us your face or maybe a screencast of what exactly you need clarification on. Perhaps upload it on a platform like YouTube, and then you send the question together with the link to the mailing list as well. I think this is good because it will help you kind of like acquire skills in using some of these tools and technologies. The plan really is for us to be able to hopefully at some stage compile these different questions sent through by you guys, and then respond to them in batches by way of maybe creating yet another screencast where we respond to the questions, or potentially scheduling an interactive session where we'll get to respond to the questions and hopefully have people ask additional questions to help I guess complement what questions others would have asked. All right, thanks. And also I just wanted to mention that homework will be made available towards the end of the week. And the homework will take, will be twofold really. There will be an individual task which is mostly going to be a reading assignment really. And then there'll be a group-based task, which is aimed at trying to help you start working towards your group-based project. All right, so with that, I guess I'll see you in lecture series number 3. Cheers, and please stay safe.